Hello, welcome to the Unofficial Gilded Age Aftershow. I am Kelsie Paul, Manager of Interpretation at the Frick Pittsburgh. Today, we are chatting about Season 2, Episode 6, Warning Shots of HBO's The Gilded Age. I am joined yet again by two of my colleagues. We have Dawn Reed-Breen, who is our Chief Curator and Director of Collections, and we also have Morgan Lawrence, who is our Collections Manager. We are talking about Episode 6. Like I said, let's start with a synopsis so that we're remembering everything that we watched. As George heads to Pittsburgh to deal with the potential strike, Bertha gets word that the Duke will return for opening night of the Met. Meanwhile, Marion gets put on the spot and Ada receives devastating news. We are going to talk about most of those things, and let's jump right in. I think we wanted to start with Dashiell's big party at the Botanical Garden. A lot happening there. His family donated a bunch of money to build a solarium at the Botanical Garden, so they are getting a beautiful plaque with their name on it. And so Dashiell throws a party. Turns out, though, that he has bigger plans for this little event than just unveiling a plaque, which we will get to in a second. But we wanted to start actually with kind of a quick moment. If you kind of blink and you miss it, you wouldn't maybe pick up on it. But we thought it was really interesting. And it's a really quick conversation that is had between Gladys and Larry. And, you know, Gladys is talking about all of these suitors that she's just kind of being inundated with. And she mentions that she's kind of being annoyed by this one guy who's like stalking her at every party that she goes to. And she's basically just telling Larry that it's exhausting, that she's constantly being sort of accosted by these men who want to marry her. And they're just all up in her grill, basically. And Larry says, you know, they're the hunters and you are the prey. And it's a really interesting line. And I know, Dawn, you were sort of, that was something that jumped out to you because you felt like, yeah, that's what was happening. That's what these heiresses were dealing with.
Yeah, her first open season. I mean, it is literal open season. It's such a gross, disgusting, accurate comment of how it must have felt for women of means as they were being pursued. Yeah, it just felt, it was a little brief moment, but a really interesting look at what courtship was like at a time when a lot of people weren't necessarily marrying for love, as we see in this super awkward public proposal.
Yes, that's a great segue to the bigger event, the bigger storyline of the party, which is this big public statement and proposal that Dashiell springs on Marion. I think I don't know about you guys, it was like I knew something was coming because everybody wanted her at that party, like too much. Like they really needed her at that party. She should have known something was coming. But yes, he puts her on the spot. It's incredibly awkward. I think collectively we all decided we are not a fan of public proposals. They are too much for us to handle.
I was like getting sweaty when he grabbed her to like walk up to the front. I was like, oh God.
Just feel
oh no, don't do it. Don't do it.
It was awful. And then to have the clapping and to hear Ada say she hasn't said yes yet. Mm-hmm. My heart just got torn to pieces watching that happen. And I so badly wanted her to just say no.
Yeah. I was going to say, she technically doesn't say yes. She says, if you want me to, which is not an enthusiastic yes, in my opinion.
It's how all great romance stories start, right?
Yeah.
If you really want me to.
But we were discussing it yesterday, and it does feel a little anachronistic. It doesn't feel quite maybe true to the period to have a big proposal like that. That's something that you definitely see nowadays. People would put lots of time and energy into really public, extravagant proposals, but marriage and courtship, we've discussed this quite a bit on the after show, which it's a much more prescribed ritual than we are used to now. There's a lot of custom, there's a lot of expectations around behavior. And, Dawn, you were saying that you felt like this probably wasn't really true. Not that it never happened, but it probably wasn't really true to the period because there's a lot of decorum and etiquette involved, as with everything in the Gilded Age.
I think I've never really read about a public proposal like this, and in reading through some of the old etiquette guidebooks, like no one has ever like definitely gather, 50 of your closest friends around and propose in public. It generally lists it as like a quiet moment, and the gentleman has probably talked to the woman's father to get permission to ask. It was also really customary for a lot of marriage proposals to be written on paper for people who might feel really nervous, or a lot of etiquette guidebooks would recommended that men make sure that they were using extremely clear language so that the woman knew what was happening, which I find kind of funny. So it was also recommended, you might be nervous or you want to make it really clear, you could put it down on paper. So I just don't know how accurate this kind of public proposal would have been in the 1880s. So awkward regardless, any time period.
Very awkward. That is very funny that essentially the woman might be just too stupid to realize that you are proposing to her. So make sure that you are making it as clear as possible so she understands what you're asking of her. Yeah. And so, we were talking, it's, I think, going to be interesting now going forward. Is Marion going to go through with this? I think that's the big question. She seems to definitely be not 100% certain that this is the right choice for her. She certainly seems like she said yes in the moment just because of the fact that she was being put on the spot. But that would have real implications for her, I think, to break an engagement. That's not going to be something that's going to be taken lightly, I feel like, in society in this time period. So it's going to be interesting. Does she do it? I hope she doesn't do it just to do it. I don't know.
I hope she doesn't do it either. And I'm really hoping, based on a couple very precise facial expressions of Larry, that this will give him just the right amount of jealousy to realize that Larry and Marion should be together. I am such a fan of the two of them and their friendship. But yeah, completely awkward. And I also think that it is very telling in this moment, too, that Dashiell is not front facing, at least noticing her resistance, and to see the reaction from Aunt Agnes, too, if she does back out of a proposal that she clearly supports with every fiber of her being. So much awkwardness for Marion.
I think we were all pretty against him earlier in the episode when he says, well, you're not a real teacher, and kind of downplays the work that she's doing, teaching English to the poor, and, really hoping the poor will understand and they'll still be poor the next day. So that was not a cool story.
Such an Aunt Agnes line. And also she is actively teaching his daughter how to paint watercolors, which is very, very telling about his perspective as well.
Yeah, perfectly nice guy, but he's not the right one for Mary. He doesn't appreciate her enough, I think. But yeah, I love, there's a very quick shot of Larry and his reaction to everything. And that to me is like, oh, he's going to figure it out. He's going to realize that he, has feelings for her. So I still have hope. I don't think she's actually going to end up with Dashiell, but we'll see how that plays out for her over the next several episodes. But we're going to turn our attention to another relationship that has turned into a really bittersweet storyline, which is Ada and Luke. Really some highs and some real devastating lows in this episode for them. Let's start with the highs, which is a scene that I think all of us really loved, which is that really sweet scene of the two of them dancing to the music box. It's lovely and sweet and really cute, and I think speaks to how genuine their relationship is. But of course, for us we're always looking for historical tidbits and things that are in the show, we sort of picked up on it because of the music box itself. And it reminded us of a very special, I guess you could call it a music box. It's a very, very big music box that we have in Clayton, our mansion. But, automated music at that time was extremely rare. It was a new technology, and not something that everyone had access to. So I know, Dawn, you're going to talk to us a little bit about that, and just our big music box, which is called an Orchestrion. Yeah,
definitely not a commonplace thing to have any sort of automated music in your home like that. Is still a luxury item. And the orchestrion in particular is a really grand, exuberant example of a music box. And this is something that the Frick family buys in 1892. And it actually did have to be wound up for the first few years of its operation, which had to be quite a chore. In 1904, they have it electrified so that it can operate without someone having to crank it up. But I love the way that they pan away from Ada and Luke dancing, and we see the maid in the hallway like physically cranking the music box. Just the fact that it like requires the labor of a human being in order to have music in your home, which I take for granted with Spotify playing constantly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have music at our fingertips anytime that we want it. So it's kind of foreign to us, I think, as modern viewers to think that there was a time where if you listened to music, you had to listen to it live. So someone was there playing an actual piano, playing a violin, whatever it was. There was no just, listening to music whenever you wanted. And if you didn't know someone who could play an instrument, you were not listening to music, which is a really weird thing for us to think about. But yeah, that's just a very kind of short, quick moment between the two of them that stood out to us that we just thought was really sweet. But of course, the sad, bigger storyline here is that Luke has been diagnosed with cancer. And, I think we all agree that we're really sad that they did this to us this quickly. Poor Ada can't catch a break. She finally gets this happy ending. And we were talking last week that we thought something was up with Luke Forte. It turns out that it's just that he's, got this illness. But I know, Morgan, you were looking into what a cancer diagnosis would really entail in this time period, because it's certainly not something that, like today where there's blood work and things like that. So what would that kind of look like for someone?
So it was actually really fascinating whenever I dove into this wormhole of medical research and diagnoses. But cancer has actually been, for lack of a better word, researched and known of since ancient societies. But it was really during this time period in the 1800s specifically where they started to utilize advanced techniques in surgery, because anesthesia became available around 1846. And so I found out that once that became rapidly available, the research aspect and the actual applications of surgery became extremely advanced. And so there were 3 different surgeons in this kind of time frame that catapulted cancer research and operations. One was located in London, the other in Germany, and actually one surgeon who was William Stewart Halsted, who was a professor of surgery at Johns Hopkins University, was another. And so in this time period, the ointment that was first described to Luke was not going to do him any good with this type of diagnosis. And so the only other option would be invasive surgery, in which they would try to remove the entire tumor along with any kind of lymph nodes in that region where the tumor was located. Like you said, Kelsie, there is no chemotherapy. There is no CT scan, PET scan, anything of that nature to give you additional information and to understand even what a kind of like metastasized cancer situation would be like. So in the case of Luke and poor Ada and Luke, my heart breaks for them. As soon as he said, "Oh, my back," I just had a feeling that something was going to go terribly wrong with him. But I'm not giving up hope, since they do live in such close proximity to one of the best surgeons in cancer operations in Baltimore and at Johns Hopkins. So with these kind of situations, if it is deemed appropriate to go in and remove the whole tumor, that would be their best course of treatment. And that is only if, one, they could afford any type of associated cost that went along with a medical procedure of this nature, and also if they had the funds to both get to these facilities where the operation would be performed. So it is a procedure and an expense that would not be available to everybody based on your socioeconomic situation.
And I would imagine that even with a doctor, yeah, Johns Hopkins is still a name that we know and is still around. But I'm guessing in the 1880s, they're still learning. Surgery's not super advanced. I feel like that even the treatment itself would probably be pretty dangerous, and potentially life-threatening. So I hope that we don't lose Luke right away. I hope that they can still be a little bit of happiness. But man, what a gut punch for all of us.
We absolutely need more of them than them going to Niagara Falls. So I am so hoping that we can see some type of resolution with his treatment.
Yeah. We'll see.
We didn't even get a full episode of them being happy newlyweds before tragedy.
Yeah, we couldn't let Ada be happy for one whole episode. It was like 30 minutes and then everything came crashing down. So we'll keep our fingers crossed on that one. We're gonna take a total pivot though and talk about the big part of the episode that we're obviously very excited about, which is we finally made it to Pittsburgh. We are in Pittsburgh. We see some Pittsburgh. We have lots and lots that we want to talk about. This is obviously a big central storyline to this episode is that, Russell gets out there. So there's a lot to unpack here. Let's start though, I guess, with kind of the beginning scene, which is the scene with George Russell and Mr. Clay on their train car. The Russells, we're I guess supposed to assume is their private train car. That jumped out to us because the Fricks also had a private train car of their own. It was called the Westmoreland. And so, Dawn, what can you tell us about the Westmoreland in particular? What this whole rail travel thing, what a luxury to have your own personal rail car.
Oh, yes. Private rail cars are basically the equivalent of your own personal jet in the late 19th and early 20th century. Henry Clay Frick purchases an 82-foot private train car from the Pullman Company in 1911, and he names it the Westmoreland after the county where he grew up. And this rail car was better appointed than a lot of people's homes during the day, and you can see that with George Russell's as well. Like there's gilding on the ceiling and the surfaces. There's these luxuriously stuffed leather couches everywhere. The Frick family's car had a dining room, observation rooms, a full kitchen, staff quarters, as well as private quarters for family and guests. There are basically 4 different bedrooms on the rail car. And then in addition to just having all of that physical space, they of course had their own china and crystal and silver and linens, everything. You didn't want to pack up all of your china and silver and bring it with you. You had to have it all totally furnished and there. So extremely well appointed. And it sets up a really great juxtaposition with the home of Henderson later in the episode. I just couldn't get over how tall the ceilings look like in the Russell car. And then once we enter Henderson's home, the camera angle came down lower and it felt much closer quarters.
Yeah. They had, the Russells and the Fricks and people like them, they are traveling nicer than people are living in their day to day, which is, just it speaks to the level of wealth, obviously, that we are seeing here. And I love this storyline. I love that we finally get to Pittsburgh. I think what's interesting for us, because we do, spend some time talking about this era on our day to day for our jobs and thinking about the Fricks and obviously that their role that they played in this kind of stuff. Henry Clay Frick was no stranger to labor disputes. He dealt with several of them during his career. Those of you who are familiar with the story of Pittsburgh, or if you've listened to some other podcasts and things, you probably have heard of the Homestead Strike, which we actually take issue with that wording a little bit. We prefer Homestead Lockout, and I'll explain why in a second. But that was the bigger labor dispute that Frick is probably best known for dealing with. That happened at the Homestead Mill here in Pittsburgh, which was owned by Carnegie Steel. At the time in 1892, Frick was handling the day-to-day operations of that mill and several others here. And so he was really the one who was dealing with negotiating a new contract for the steel workers at that mill that year. And the reason that we take issue with the word strike, and you'll often hear, when people talk about Homestead, you'll hear the word strike, you'll hear that, the workers walked out and so they went on strike. That's not actually accurate to what happened at Homestead in 1892. A more accurate representation, which we see references to it from Russell, which I'll talk about in a second, but Frick actually locked the workers out. He is the one that made the decision to lock them out. He offers them a new contract and says, take it or leave it. The workers make it clear that they're not going to take it. And so in response, he locks them out and sort of forces them out so that he can bring new workers in. And that was part of a playbook. We talk about that quite a bit, which is that industrialists like Frick, or George Russell for that matter, had a playbook that they worked off of when labor disputes like this happened in their industries. And this is not just the steel industry at the time, it's across multiple. We actually have a collection of newspaper headlines from 1894, so a year after where the show is set in this season. And you can see the whole front page of the newspaper is just different labor disputes all across industries, all across the country. And so it was happening a lot, and industrialists sort of had a playbook. And you see that with Russell and Clay when they're on the train car. They have a blueprint sort of the mill, and they're talking about bringing in the state militia. They're talking about getting support from the governor. They talk about bringing in the Pinkertons, which were a private security force. So there really was kind of a prescribed way to handle something like this. And then, of course, you see the flip side of that from the workers' perspective, too. They have their own playbook that they follow. Striking was certainly, and unionizing was certainly the two tools in their arsenal, essentially, was taking their labor away and then collectively bargaining as a union, which worked some of the time and sometimes it didn't. We've heard Russell, voice his opinion that he can always get more workers. He can bring in replacement workers, or scabs as they were called at the time. And obviously that's what we see kind of play out in the episode, is this tension. But it did often end up violently. Homestead was a violent example. Several people died as a result of the lockout at Homestead. The state militia did have to be brought in to get order back and to basically give them the control of the mill back to Frick and to Carnegie Steel. So the ending of this episode for Russell is where the storyline diverges a little bit from the historical reality. And I know, Dawn, you were talking about the fact that we also see in the episode some interesting commentary, I think, on ownership. Who owns these mills, right? Because the industrialists certainly believe that they own it. The companies do own it, but there's also a feeling of ownership on the part of the workers. They feel invested in these places. And I think that's something that can get taken for granted if you're not kind of familiar with these towns that were around these mills.
Yeah, I think you hear George Russell say a couple of times in the episodes, like, these are my mills. This is my, this is my property, basically. But I think the workers are also thinking that they have contributed to the success of industry, and they also have ownership over their own jobs. And that even if the physical property of the mill isn't theirs, their jobs, they account for the success of that, and they have rights to their jobs because of that. So there's always really interesting ideas about property rights between unions and manufacturers, and they do kind of tackle that a little bit with this episode.
And you see the investment from this community. I think I've shouted them out before, but I will shout them out again, which is our friends and colleagues over at a wonderful organization called Rivers of Steel here in Pittsburgh. They are preserving and interpreting the industrial history of Pittsburgh. So if you are in the city and you are interested in this history and storyline, absolutely go check them out. We're going to share a link to their website as well. So don't miss that. If you are interested in this, I really encourage you to go learn from them because they are the experts. But, what I've learned from them is the importance of understanding that these mill towns, these steel mills, they are communities of people. And you see that represented in the show when Russell walks out of Henderson's house, and all of these townspeople have gathered to watch him kind of be here and sort of make their presence known. And I think that's really important to remember because that is the motivation for these workers. They don't see these mills as just a job. This is their livelihood. These are their communities. And a good friend of ours who works over at Rivers of Steel, Ryan Henderson, he said something interesting once that has really stuck with me, which is that he said, if you think about these steel mills, kind of like a wheel, the mill itself is the hub of the wheel, around which these communities sort of spin around, and everything is centralized at the mill, but all of the little spokes that come off of it are these communities. So if you lived in a mill town, you knew a steel worker, your husband, your son, whoever it was working in the steel mill, or you had some sort of business that contributed to that community or to the steel mill. So the steel industry was so central and so vital to these communities, which is why they were willing to fight so hard, for their jobs. And I think we do see that in the show play out. But the other thing that we want to talk about is that if you are a listener of the official podcast, if you listened to this episode, you would have heard Henry Clay Frick's name for the first time. And we finally got confirmation on something that Dawn, I know, has been suspicious of for a long time. She called it. I will give her credit for it. She called it last season, which is that Mr. Clay is sort of loosely inspired or based on Henry Clay Frick. According to executive producer David Crockett, it is not an accident that his name is Mr. Clay. Mm-hmm. He is supposed to represent, I think, the ruthlessness of men like Frick. But I guess in that scenario, Russell is supposed to be the Carnegie in this situation. And I know we all take issue. I just saw the smirk on Dawn's face. I'm gonna say, Dawn, tell us how you feel about that.
I always feel like Carnegie's reputation survives the Homestead Steel strike so differently than Frick's. And Frick goes down as this, ruthless, hard-nosed, heavy hitter, which I am not saying he was not. He absolutely was. He is really ruthless. These men came into positions of power by thinking in certain ways. And I think part of that was in dehumanizing the people who are working within the mills and kind of being able to reduce them down to inputs and product. And I think that's where we see Russell, like once he sees Henderson's family and comes into his home, that's the big dramatic moment for him where he realizes oh, these workers are actual people. But Carnegie, he was away in Scotland and he just had this really wonderful excuse to be like, oh, I had no idea what was happening at the mills. I've been on vacation. Whereas that was not the case. Frick and Carnegie were in close correspondence the entire time. Carnegie knew entirely what Frick was going to do. And Frick had Carnegie's support in all of the actions that he took. Carnegie was equally as ruthless, but Frick will kind of forever be more closely associated with it. And I remember last season when I saw this character first show up and his name was Clay, I was just like, I don't know, there has to be some sort of connection there. So interesting to know that Frick was in their mind in creating this character in this storyline.
And it is, I think that is maybe the most inaccurate part of this storyline is George going to the town anyway, but also to go to Henderson's house, to also then be there in the middle of this melee and this tension that happens. That is not what these men were really doing. And I know, Morgan, you made the point that was how they managed to kind of dehumanize their workers, is that there's always a separation. They're never the ones that are dealing directly with these negotiations, and it allows them to kind of take a step back and sort of compartmentalize what's going on and justify their behavior in that way. So George is not representing quite the accurate thing there.
Absolutely. And it is so almost natural for them to consider everyone in their social group as full-fledged human beings that deserve opera openings and tablescapes that are perfectly measured and the finest of everything, and any kind of disassociation from that strict regime of decorum is just unimaginable, and the consequences are dire. But then whenever you are put into an environment like they're doing with this past episode, where you're going to these people's homes, you're seeing their children's faces, you understand and could very well be making the decision in that moment to be responsible for people getting murdered at your word. And not only that, but some these industrialist tycoons like Frick and Carnegie would not be necessarily going to an average day at the mills that they own and being able to see firsthand the maiming of the workers that they are employing. And so it is such a way, like you said, to compartmentalize and to disassociate yourself with the responsibility of inflicting violence to other people.
Yeah. I'm just so interested to know where the show is going to go with this storyline, because I feel like in essence, George has the workers are going to see this as an acquiescence on George's part. So I just don't know what the next step in this story is going to be, because it does depart from the reality of so many labor disputes that turn violent. Like, this was not an uncommon story in this time period. I just don't know where they're going next with this.
Well, and even a couple of episodes ago, when we saw Russell meet with all of the other industrialists, and they were all talking about, you know, the different things that they were going through in their separate industries, they essentially make the point that, you know, we all have to be strong against this, because if any of us show weakness, it's going to undercut the rest of us. And so that's essentially what George has done. I mean, they, you know, his fellow industrialists would call it a weakness. We would maybe call it a moment of compassion and humanity, but they call it a weakness. And so, yeah, it's going, you know, there are going to be implications. He has, you know, for better or for worse, he has given up a little bit of a bargaining chip by showing his humanity in this moment. And so it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, because that is not normally how it would go in the actual historical record of these kinds of events. So,
and Clay really calls him out in that moment too. Like, he is just revolted at this decision that George makes.
Because he does not know, nor does he care whether those children go to school. And he doesn't care
and if they had
live or
8
die.
hours of time to themselves, I mean, it would just be licentiousness and mayhem, you know. God forbid these men have, you know, 8 hours to do
what they
have leisure or spend time with their family, or, you know, to read. Go to the libraries that Carnegie is building endless numbers of, that the workers have no time to actually go to.
I will just say, oh, sorry, go ahead, Morgan.
It makes me wonder too if Clay, he just is such a snake to me, and I wonder if he's just going to jump ship completely and go to a competitor and create some kind of wider conspiracy against George Russell, but we'll see where it goes. I'm excited to see.
Yeah, I don't think this is the end of, I think this is probably just the beginning of some tension that we're going to see between Clay and Russell, which is interesting because, I mean, it's never super clear to us, I think, what Clay does within Russell's company. He's kind of just like his right-hand henchman in some ways, which I think some people would say that's sort of what Frick was to Carnegie, maybe. But I will just say, the last thing I will say is I take issue with popular Hollywood representations of the Frick-Carnegie relationship. For some reason, the Frick character is always cast as an older guy. And that I don't understand why. Carnegie was decades older than Frick was. I mean, how old is Frick in 1892? He's
32. Yeah.
I mean, he's not an old guy. He's a young man, kind of more at the beginning of his career. So just the fact that Russell is sort of in the Carnegie role and Clay is in the Frick role, but he's the older guy, it just bugs me. It's neither here nor there. It just bugs me.
Oh, wait, I said he was in his 30s. He was in his 40s,
Okay.
right?
But still a young guy. He's
Yeah.
not like, yeah, he's much younger than Carnegie at that point. Carnegie is like retired and like an old man in 1892.
But we were also talking about how the actor who plays Russell is kind of a cuddly teddy bear, and like I want him to be a good
Yes.
character.
Well, he's a central character. They obviously, for the show's purpose, Dawn, you always are good about reminding me that this is a show. It is for entertainment, which, obviously they want us to identify with the Russells in some way. They are, our main characters. So they want us to have some kind of connection to us. So of course, they weren't going to have Russell being like, yeah, go ahead, shoot him, because that would definitely make him a more unlikable character. But yes, he has maintained his cuddly teddy bear, status in some ways, but we'll
for
see.
now.
For now. So really quickly, we want to keep an eye on our time. We don't want to go too long, but really quickly, we don't want to ignore another really interesting storyline that is introduced in this episode, which is through Peggy, which is this story about as they call them, the colored schools in New York City. We've learned that there is a threat from the city essentially to close these schools down, which Peggy and her community and her mom and other people are obviously not wanting to happen. And so Peggy gets involved in this fight to keep these schools open, and she meets a new character to us, Sarah Garnett. And of course, as we always do when we meet a new character in the Gilded Age, we start Googling to find out if they are a real person. And lo and behold, Sarah Garnett was a real person. And I know, Morgan, we're going to talk about more about her next week because her storyline is going to continue to evolve. But what can you tell us a little bit about the real Sarah and kind of what her story is and how she fits into this storyline?
Yeah, so upon my Googling, I was thrilled to find out that Sarah Garnett was in fact a real person. And she actually was born in Brooklyn, and she actually died in Brooklyn as well. So that part was completely factual as well. She was the oldest of 11 kids, and her father was actually a Black farmer who was one of the early investor pool in Weeksville, which was a Black community based in Brooklyn in the 1830s. And so during that upbringing, I was reading from the Brooklyn Library's resource pool that it was really important to Sarah's parents for all of their kids to have a good education. And so after Sarah received her education, she went on to become a teacher, which was an extremely popular career path for Black women during this time period because there were so few options, even for middle class prospering Black families and communities. So this was the path that Sarah leaned into. And so she ended up being an educator, I think, for about 50 years, maybe a little bit more than 50. And she ended up becoming the principal of a New York City public school. It was Manhattan Grammar School number 4. And it was an integrated school system. So both Black and white pupils were taught within the school that she was an instructor at. And it was really interesting to find out that both being an educator and a suffragette was part of Sarah's history and later activism in the 1880s. And she actually was a co-founder of the Equal Suffrage League in Brooklyn and hosted visits and performed speeches and organized speeches both with and for American and British suffragettes. So I don't think that this is going to be the end of Sarah's storyline with us in the Gilded Age, or Peggy for that matter, and her growing relationship with writing an article for the cause of the school system. And I'm really, really interested to see if this is Peggy's pathway into more of the suffragette movement overall during this time.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see. I feel like we're getting some really fascinating female characters in this season. We talked last season about the fact that this really is a female-driven show. I mean, most of the main characters are women. But first we had Emily Roebling, and I think she's going to kind of come back into the story next episode. So I love that we're getting these actual real women characters that are based on real actual historical women that did these really incredible things, and we're getting to learn more about them through the show. So I think that's super fun and so important. I did also do just like a really cursory search, but thought this was fascinating that the school that Sarah was principal at, I think recently was saved as a historical landmark. So it does still stand, and it was kind of in danger of being torn down, but it's been designated a landmark just really recently, I think, which is really cool. So if you're interested in that, I would encourage you guys out there, our viewers, to do some Googling, check it out if you're in New York. It's really an important part of that history that I think we're going to talk about more as we see the storyline progress. Before we go, we'll just do a really quick viewer question. We had a question from a viewer from last week. We were talking about the rivalry between Bertha and Turner, and a viewer asked whether or not we knew of any real examples of that kind of sabotage between two society rivals. I don't know that we do, but I don't, that doesn't mean that it didn't happen, in my opinion.
I think the rivalry between Carrie Astor and Alva Vanderbilt was absolutely a real thing. I don't know of any soup sabotages, at least in my research.
There's no historical record of plans to spill soup, but that doesn't mean, it doesn't mean that they weren't actively undercutting each other. I mean, I think the opera war is honestly probably the best example of that, which is these concerted efforts on both of these women's parts to undercut each other through their respective operas. I think we're gonna see that representation in the show come to a head as well as we get to opera night, the opening night at both of these operas. So I think there's a nugget of truth to it. Maybe not with the soup, but I think there's something to that. But we'll probably never know. So thank you so much for being with us for episode 6. Join us back here next week for episode 7, Wonders Never Cease. As New York celebrates a historic event, Bertha reconsiders her loyalty to the Met, and Marian has doubts about her future. So we will have no shortage of fun things to talk about next week. Thank you for being here. As always, like and subscribe to our videos, and we'll see you back next week. Thank you so much.